Queen Isabella thought she was throwing the most glorious party in history. 400 of Europe's most powerful nobles filled her palace, dazzled by diamonds, drowning in wine, unaware they had stepped into a trap centuries in the making. As midnight struck, the chandeliers fell, the curtains ignited, and the palace became a furnace of revenge. This wasn't an accident. This was justice. But who lit the first match? And why did they want her emeralds to melt into her throat? Comment if you think vengeance justified the fire. Like if you felt the flames. Subscribe to uncover the twisted truth behind history's most explosive betrayals. The silk curtains trembled in the candlelight as Queen Isabella adjusted her emerald necklace one final time, unaware that within hours, those same emeralds would melt against her throat in flames that would consume everything she had ever known. The year was 1734, and the Palace of Versailles had never seen such opulence gathered under one roof. Yet beneath the golden chandeliers and marble floors, a web of vengeance had been carefully woven by those who had waited decades for this moment of perfect, terrible justice. The evening began like any other grand celebration, with carriages arriving in endless procession through the palace gates, their wheels crunching over gravel that sparkled like diamonds in the torchlight. Noble families emerged in their finest silks and velvets, their faces painted with the artificial beauty of the aristocracy, each one carrying secrets darker than the night itself. Among them walked Count Philippe de Montclair, his hands steady, despite knowing that hidden beneath his ornate coat lay the tools that would soon transform this palace of dreams into a monument of screams. Isabella had orchestrated this gathering with meticulous care, believing it would cement her legacy as the most magnificent queen in European history. 400 of the continent's most powerful figures had accepted her invitation, drawn by promises of entertainment so spectacular that it would be spoken of for generations. She had no way of knowing that her prophecy would prove terrifyingly accurate, though not in the manner she had envisioned. The ballroom stretched before her like a golden sea, filled with the laughter and conversation of those who considered themselves untouchable, their voices rising and falling like waves against the ornate walls that would soon become their tomb. The musicians struck their first notes as couples began to dance, their movements graceful and practiced, each step a performance of power and privilege. Yet watching from the shadows of the great pillars, servants moved with unusual urgency, their eyes holding secrets that burned brighter than the hundreds of candles illuminating the scene. These were not ordinary servants, but members of a revolutionary cell that had infiltrated the palace months earlier, each one chosen for their ability to blend invisibly into the background while carrying out a plan so audacious that its very conception bordered on madness. Marie Delacroix, the head chambermaid who had served the royal family for 15 years, moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, her footsteps silent on the marble floors that had witnessed countless acts of cruelty disguised as statecraft. Her own daughter had died in the dungeons beneath this very palace, tortured for the crime of stealing bread to feed her starving infant, and tonight Marie would finally balance the scales of justice with interest accumulated over years of patient planning. The keys that jingled softly at her waist were not merely instruments of service, but weapons of liberation, each one carefully duplicated and distributed to her fellow conspirators, who waited in strategic positions throughout the vast complex. The Duke of Burgundy raised his crystal goblet in a toast to the Queen's magnificence, the wine within gleaming like liquid rubies in the candlelight, while his wife, Lady Catherine, smiled with practiced grace, her fan fluttering like butterfly wings that would soon be consumed in flames hotter than the fires of hell itself. Their youngest son, a boy of merely 12 summers, stood beside them in his miniature court dress, his innocent eyes wide with wonder at the splendor surrounding him, unaware that his parents' crimes against the common people had sealed his fate along with theirs. The palace kitchens below bustled with activity as dozens of servants prepared the final courses of what would be history's most expensive funeral feast. Steam rose from silver platters laden with delicacies that could have fed entire villages, while the conspirators among the kitchen staff moved with deadly purpose, their actions coordinated by signals passed through seemingly innocent gestures. The massive stone ovens that had cooked for royalty would soon become furnaces of a different sort, their fires spreading upward through carefully prepared channels that would turn the entire structure into a crematorium worthy of the gods themselves. Philippe checked his pocket watch, its golden hands marking the passage of time toward the moment when justice would finally be served with the precision of a master chef's blade. His own father had been broken on the wheel in the palace courtyard for the crime of organizing a peaceful protest against the crushing taxes that kept the poor in perpetual bondage, while the nobility feasted on luxury beyond imagination. That execution had been attended by the same guests who now danced above his father's unmarked grave, their laughter echoing in Philippa's memory like the sound of demons celebrating in the depths of perdition. The Queen's personal confessor, Father Benedictus, moved through the crowd offering blessings that would prove hollow before the night was through, his heavy cross catching the light as it swayed against his chest with each step. Unknown to the gathered nobility, this holy man had been slowly poisoning the Queen's mind with carefully planted suggestions and manufactured visions, preparing her soul for the judgment that awaited in the flames. His God was not the merciful deity preached from gilded pulpits, but the terrible angel of justice who demanded blood payment for centuries of oppression. Lady Margaret of Northumberland adjusted her diamond tiara with manicured fingers that had never known labor, her skin pale and soft from a lifetime of protection from the harsh realities that plagued her subjects. Her husband had personally ordered the execution of 300 peasants who dared to question the divine right of kings, and tonight she would learn that divinity offers no protection against the democracy of fire. The jewels that adorned her throat would melt into a necklace of molten agony, each precious stone becoming a drop of liquid pain that would brand her flesh with the marks of her husband's victims. As the clock struck 11, the orchestra began playing a waltz that would become known as the Dance of Death, its haunting melody weaving through the air like silk scarves that would soon ignite with the intensity of shooting stars. The couples who glided across the polished floor moved in perfect synchronization, their bodies creating patterns of grace and beauty that would be transformed into writhing shapes of terror before the dawn brought its cold revelation of justice fulfilled. The wine cellars beneath the palace had been secretly flooded with oil and other combustible materials, creating a foundation of fire that would ensure no stone remained unturned in the accounting of royal sins. The vintage bottles that contained liquid treasures worth more than entire townships would explode like bombs, their contents feeding flames that would rise through the building's bones with the inevitability of divine retribution. Each cork that popped would sound like gunshots announcing the arrival of revolution, dressed in the robes of an avenging angel. Count Alessandro di Firenze whispered sweet compliments into the ear of the Duchess of Lorraine, his breath warm against her perfumed skin as he described the beauty of the evening, never suspecting that his words were prophecy spoken in ignorance of their true meaning. The Duchess smiled and blushed, her heart fluttering with romantic excitement that would soon transform into the terror of prey, trapped by predators more cunning than any wolf that prowled the forests surrounding the palace grounds. The palace guards who remained loyal to the crown had been systematically eliminated throughout the evening, their bodies hidden in locations where they would never be found until the flames consumed all evidence of the night's careful orchestration. Those guards who had shown sympathy for the people's plight had been recruited into the conspiracy, their knowledge of the palace's defenses proving invaluable in planning an assault from within that would make the walls themselves accomplices in the destruction of their inhabitants. Young Prince Henri, the Queen's nephew and heir apparent, danced with the ambassador's daughter, their youthful laughter ringing through the ballroom like silver bells that would soon be silenced by the bronze voice of justice calling all debts due and payable in full. The prince had never known want or fear, his life a series of pleasures and privileges built upon the suffering of millions who died in poverty, while he played with toys worth more than their entire lifetimes of labor. The great tapestries that decorated the walls told stories of royal conquests and glorious battles, each thread woven with the skill of masters who had died in obscurity, while their work brought fame to those who merely possessed the gold to purchase it. Tonight, these artistic treasures would become fuel for fires that would tell a different story, one written in smoke and flame across the sky for all the world to read and remember. The heroic kings and queens depicted in silk and gold would burn alongside their living descendants, their painted faces melting into expressions of horror that more accurately reflected the reality of their reigns. Marie moved through the servants' corridors with silent determination, her hands distributing the final implements of destruction to her fellow conspirators who had waited their entire lives for this moment of perfect revenge. The hidden passages that honeycombed the palace walls, originally designed to allow servants to move unseen, while attending to their master's needs, had become arteries through which revolutionary blood would flow, carrying destruction to every corner of the vast complex with surgical precision. The queen herself paused before a mirror framed in silver and adorned with cherubs, whose innocent faces would soon be blackened by smoke and heat, adjusting her appearance one final time before greeting her subjects in what would be their last earthly audience. Her reflection showed a woman at the height of her power and beauty, surrounded by luxury that represented the accumulated wealth of a nation bled dry to support her extravagance. The mirror would crack and shatter from the heat, each fragment reflecting a different aspect of her terror as the flames approached with the inevitability of death itself. Philippe positioned himself near the great staircase, where he could observe the entire ballroom, while remaining concealed behind a pillar carved with images of dancing nymphs and leering satyrs, whose expressions would prove prophetic before the night reached its climax. His hand moved to the specially crafted device concealed within his coat, a masterpiece of engineering that would ignite multiple fires simultaneously throughout the palace, ensuring that no area remained untouched by the cleansing flames of justice. The palace's ventilation system, originally designed to keep the air fresh and comfortable for the royal family, had been modified by infiltrators who understood that fire needed oxygen to reach its full destructive potential. Ducts and chimneys that once carried away smoke and odors would become conduits for flames, spreading destruction through the building's respiratory system like a disease that consumed from within while presenting a healthy appearance on the surface. Lady Elizabeth de Vere conversed with the Spanish ambassador about trade agreements that would never be signed, their discussion of profit margins and market shares taking on a grotesque irony as they stood unknowingly at the center of an economic transaction where their lives would be the currency exchanged for decades of exploitation and cruelty. The ambassador's diplomatic immunity would prove worthless against flames that recognized no earthly authority, acknowledging only the higher court of cosmic justice. The children's quarters on the upper floors had been evacuated by conspirators who drew the line at harming innocents, though many of the young nobles present at the ball had already been corrupted by the privileges of their birth and would grow into the same monsters as their parents if allowed to survive. The nursemaids who carried sleeping babies to safety through hidden passages wept for the childhood that would be lost to these privileged infants who would now face the harsh realities that common children had always known. Father Benedictus raised his hands to offer a blessing over the assembled company, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the authority of divine commission, though the words he spoke were not prayers for protection, but invocations that called down the wrath of a deity who had grown weary of earthly injustice. The Latin phrases that rolled from his tongue were ancient formulas for binding spirits to sacred purposes, and tonight the spirit of retribution would be bound to the flames that would consume palace and palace dwellers alike. The clock in the great tower began to chime the midnight hour, each bronze note reverberating through the stone walls like the heartbeat of a dying giant, marking not just the passage from one day to the next, but the transition from an age of royal tyranny to an era where the people would remember that kings and queens were merely mortals dressed in expensive costumes. The 12th chime would serve as the signal for the conspiracy to begin its final act, transforming celebration into catastrophe with the precision of a master playwright directing tragedy. Marie's network of fellow servants moved through the palace like blood cells carrying poison through a body, each one carrying out their assigned role in the evening's deadly choreography. The laundresses who had washed bloodstains from royal garments now prepared to add their own contributions to the palace's crimson legacy, while the stable boys who had tended horses that carried their masters to hunting expeditions where peasants were the prey now ensured that no escape route remained open to those who had made escape impossible for so many others. The royal treasury, located deep within the palace's heart, had been prepared with special care by conspirators who understood that the love of money was indeed the root of all evil, and that burning the accumulated wealth of the crown would send a message that echoed through every bank and counting house in Europe. Gold and silver would melt and flow like rivers of molten gilt, while precious gems would crack and shatter under heat that transformed their crystalline perfection into fragments of worthless mineral matter. Count Philippe felt his heart racing as the final moments approached, not from fear but from anticipation of justice finally being served after years of planning and patience. His mother had died of starvation during the harsh winter, when the royal family had stockpiled grain while the people ate bark and leather, and tonight her spirit would feast on the destruction of those who had valued their comfort above human life. The flames that would consume the palace would burn brighter than any funeral pyre, carrying her soul and millions of others finally to the peace that had been denied them in life. The palace's electrical system, recently installed to demonstrate the royal family's embrace of modern technology, had been sabotaged by infiltrators who understood that progress could be turned against those who wielded it without wisdom or compassion. Wires that should have carried illumination would instead carry ignition, spreading fire through the building's nervous system with the speed of thought and the certainty of divine judgment. The very innovations that the nobility had adopted to display their superiority would become instruments of their destruction. Lady Catherine de Medicis raised her fan to hide a yawn. Bored by the evening's entertainment, despite its unprecedented extravagance, her jaded appetite for luxury having grown beyond the ability of earthly pleasures to satisfy. Within minutes, she would experience sensations more intense than any she had ever imagined. Her nervous system flooded with terror that would make her understand why the peasants she had tortured for her amusement had screamed so desperately for mercy that never came. The palace's famous Hall of Mirrors, where so many treaties had been signed and alliances forged, reflected the dancing couples in infinite multiplication, creating an army of images that would soon become an army of victims as the mirrors cracked and shattered from the heat. Each reflected face would fragment into dozens of expressions of terror, multiplying the horror exponentially as reality exceeded even the most twisted imagination's capacity to envision suffering. Philippe's hand tightened on the activation device as he watched Queen Isabella raise her own hand to call for attention, preparing to deliver a speech that would be remembered not for its words, but for the manner of its interruption. Her voice, trained from childhood to command absolute obedience, would soon be reduced to the same animalistic screams that had echoed from the dungeons where her enemies had been tortured for her entertainment. The servants who had remained loyal to the crown cowered in corners as they began to understand that something terrible was about to unfold, their instincts warning them of danger even as their minds struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the conspiracy that surrounded them. Those who tried to warn their masters found their words dismissed as hysteria or drunkenness. The same arrogance that had blinded the nobility to the suffering of their subjects, now preventing them from recognizing the approach of their own doom. Marie gave the final signal by dropping a silver tray, its clatter echoing through the ballroom like the sound of fate's dice hitting the table where destinies were decided by forces beyond human control. The seemingly accidental noise triggered a cascade of actions throughout the palace, as conspirators in every corner of the vast complex began the process that would transform opulent celebration into historical tragedy within minutes. The first flames appeared in the wine cellars, rising from pools of oil that had been carefully spread across floors where vintages worth kingdoms had been stored for generations, waiting for occasions grand enough to justify their consumption. The irony was perfect, as liquid treasures became liquid fire, their value transformed from monetary to destructive in the space of heartbeats that would soon stop forever for those who had hoarded wealth while others died of want. Philippe activated his device as Queen Isabella opened her mouth to speak, her first word becoming her last coherent sound as the palace transformed around her from sanctuary to slaughterhouse in seconds that stretched like eternities for those who experienced them. The carefully planned ignition sequence began with scientific precision, each fire blooming exactly where it had been designed to appear, creating a network of destruction that covered the entire palace complex with mathematical certainty. The tapestries that had been treated with accelerants burst into flames that climbed toward the ceiling with the hunger of living creatures, their beautiful images transforming into writhing shapes that resembled damned souls, clawing their way toward salvation that would never come. The very art that had celebrated royal power became a canvas for depicting royal powerlessness as fire rewrote history with brushstrokes of orange and red. The great doors that had admitted so many guests to their doom proved immovable, despite desperate efforts by nobles who threw themselves against oak that had been reinforced with iron bands by conspirators who understood that a trap is only effective if its prey cannot escape. The sound of fists pounding against wood mixed with screams of terror and rage as the reality of their situation became undeniably clear to minds that had never considered the possibility of their own mortality. Queen Isabella's voice rose above the chaos in a shriek, that shattered crystal glasses throughout the ballroom, her royal composure dissolving like sugar in rain as she realized that her palace had become her prison and her celebration had become her execution. The emeralds around her throat began to heat from the approaching flames, each precious stone becoming a coal that pressed against flesh that had never known physical discomfort more severe than a pinprick from a thorny rose. The orchestra continued playing, even as smoke began to fill the air, their musical training overriding their survival instincts as they performed the waltz that would accompany the dance of death now beginning on the ballroom floor. The melody that had inspired graceful movement now provided rhythm for the frantic scrambling of trapped animals, seeking escape from a predator more relentless than any creature that stalked the natural world. Philippe watched with cold satisfaction as his years of planning bore fruit more terrible than any harvest ever gathered by human hands. Each scream that rose from the burning palace, a note in a symphony of justice that had been composed in the blood of innocence and orchestrated by those who had suffered beyond the ability of words to express. His own death in the flames would be a small price to pay for the destruction of a system that had treated human beings as expendable resources in the service of royal luxury. The palace's famous spiral staircase, carved from single blocks of marble by master craftsmen who had died in poverty, while their work brought glory to those who merely possessed the gold to purchase it, began to crack and crumble as heat expanded the stone beyond its ability to maintain structural integrity. Guests who had climbed those stairs in triumph just hours before now found themselves trapped on upper floors as their only means of escape became rubble that blocked their path to salvation. The smoke that poured through the ventilation system carried with it the smell of burning silk, melting gold and cooking flesh, a perfume of destruction that would linger in the nostrils of any survivors for the remainder of their shortened lives. The same air that had carried the scents of expensive perfumes and exotic spices now delivered the aroma of justice, being served at temperatures that transformed solid matter into gas and memory. Father Benedictus raised his crucifix toward the ceiling as flames began to lick at the hem of his robes, his prayers now genuine appeals for mercy from a God who had grown weary of being invoked to justify earthly cruelty and oppression. The silver cross that had blessed so many acts of violence performed in the name of divine authority began to melt against his chest, creating a brand that marked him as a false prophet who had served Mammon while claiming to serve the Almighty. The children who had been present at the gathering clung to parents who could offer no protection from the advancing inferno, their innocent voices calling for help that would never come, while their futures disappeared in flames that made no distinction between guilt and innocence when dispensing justice that had been delayed for generations. The sight of their terror drove some adults to acts of desperate heroism that proved futile against barriers that had been designed by those who understood that revolution requires absolute commitment to its goals. The palace guards who remained attempted to maintain order among guests who had abandoned all pretense of civilization in their desperate struggle for survival, but their training had prepared them to deal with external threats rather than internal combustion that turned the very building into an enemy more implacable than any human foe. Their uniforms caught fire as they tried to organize evacuation through exits that no longer existed, their oaths of loyalty becoming meaningless in the face of flames that recognized no earthly authority. Lady Margaret's diamond tiara melted into a crown of molten stone that seared her scalp while her silk gown transformed into a second skin of fire that clung to her body with embraces more intimate than any lover had ever provided. Her screams mixed with those of hundreds of others to create a chorus that would haunt the dreams of anyone fortunate or unfortunate enough to survive the night and bear witness to justice served without mercy or compassion. The palace's library, containing thousands of volumes that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, became fuel for flames that consumed philosophy and poetry, mathematics and music with equal appetite, erasing the intellectual heritage of Western civilization in minutes that passed like hours for those who experienced their destruction. Leather bindings and parchment pages created clouds of smoke that carried the dreams and wisdom of generations up into the night sky where they dissipated like the ghosts of murdered thoughts. Felipe felt the heat beginning to affect his own clothing as he maintained his position near the great staircase, his commitment to witnessing the complete fulfillment of his plan requiring him to remain until the very end of the drama he had authored with such careful attention to detail. His skin began to blister from the rising temperature, but the pain only increased his satisfaction as he finally experienced a fraction of the suffering his family had endured at the hands of those who now writhed in agony around him. The wine that had flowed so freely during the evening's celebration now fed flames that burned with colors as beautiful as they were terrible, each vintage contributing its own hue to the rainbow of destruction that painted the ballroom walls with shades of orange, red, and yellow that no artist had ever captured on canvas. The very liquids that had brought joy and intoxication to the royal court now brought death and incineration with efficiency that surpassed any military weapon ever devised by human ingenuity. Queen Isabella's personal chambers, where she had slept peacefully while her subjects died of starvation and disease, became a furnace that melted even the gold decorations that adorned every surface of rooms designed to display wealth beyond the imagination of common people. Her bed, where she had dreamed of greater glories and expanded territories, became a pyre that burned with heat intense enough to crack marble and shatter diamonds into fragments that reflected light like tears shed by angels witnessing the fall of earthly powers. The conspiracy's timing proved perfect as dawn approached and the flames reached their peak intensity, creating a beacon visible for miles around the palace grounds as servants and peasants gathered to watch the destruction of the symbol that had oppressed them for generations. Their faces, illuminated by the light of burning tyranny, showed not horror but satisfaction as they witnessed the evening when the scales of justice finally balanced after centuries of tipping toward those who possessed gold rather than those who possessed righteousness. Marie emerged from the secret tunnels that had allowed key conspirators to escape before the palace became completely engulfed, her clothes singed and her face blackened by smoke, but her eyes bright with the satisfaction of mission accomplished after years of planning and patience. She carried with her testimonies of the atrocities she had witnessed, stories that would fuel future revolutions and ensure that the night's events would be remembered not as accident, but as deliberate judgment rendered by those who had nothing left to lose except their chains. The flames found the royal treasury, where chests of gold coins melted into rivers of molten metal that flowed through the palace corridors like veins of liquid sun, their value dissolved in temperatures that transformed currency into slag and reduced the accumulated wealth of nations to worthless mineral matter. The counting rooms where scribes had calculated the profits extracted from human suffering became furnaces, where mathematics was reduced to ashes and accounting ledgers became fuel for fires that balanced books written in blood. As the sun rose over the smoldering ruins of what had once been the greatest palace in Europe, investigators would find bodies positioned throughout the structure in ways that told the story of the night's events more clearly than any official report could ever document. Queen Isabella's corpse lay at the base of her throne, her arms stretched toward doors that had never opened, her emerald necklace fused to her throat in a collar of green fire that had become her final crown and eternal reminder of the price of earthly vanity. The investigation that followed revealed evidence of conspiracy so extensive that authorities chose to suppress most details rather than risk inspiring similar actions throughout Europe, where other palaces stood filled with other tyrants who had grown comfortable in their assumption of divine protection from earthly consequences. The official report spoke of faulty wiring and accidental ignition, but the people whispered different stories in taverns and marketplaces, tales of justice served by those who understood that sometimes revolution requires flames as well as words. Philippe's body was discovered in the ruins of the Great Staircase, his hand still clutching the device that had ignited the fires, his face peaceful despite the terrible manner of his death, as if he had finally found the rest that had eluded him since watching his family perish at royal command. His revolution had succeeded not through political maneuvering or military conquest, but through the simple recognition that fire burns all flesh equally and that death comes to palace and cottage alike when summoned by those who understand that justice delayed is not justice denied, but justice concentrated into a force more powerful than any crown or scepter ever wielded by mortal hands. The aftermath of the palace fire sent shockwaves throughout every royal court in Europe, as monarchs suddenly realized their own vulnerability to the revolutionary fervor that had consumed their French counterparts. Emergency meetings were called in Vienna, London, Madrid, and St. Petersburg, as rulers who had previously considered themselves divinely protected began installing new security measures and questioning the loyalty of their own servants with paranoia that bordered on madness. Cardinal Rossetti, who had escaped the flames by pure chance, having left early due to a sudden illness, became the primary witness whose testimony would shape historical understanding of the night's events. His account, written in trembling handwriting while still recovering from smoke inhalation, described scenes of terror so vivid that readers experienced nightmares for years afterward. The cardinal spoke of seeing Queen Isabella's emerald necklace glowing like hellfire around her throat as she screamed for salvation that would never come, her royal dignity stripped away to reveal the frightened animal that lurked beneath every human facade. The investigation teams that arrived at dawn found evidence that painted a picture of conspiracy so thorough and well-planned that it elevated the unknown perpetrators to the level of criminal masterminds whose organizational skills exceeded those of most legitimate governments. Every detail had been considered, from the placement of accelerants to the timing of ignition, creating a sequence of destruction that unfolded with the precision of a Swiss timepiece and the inevitability of natural law. The neighboring villages, which had suffered under royal taxation for generations, erupted in celebration when news of the palace's destruction reached their humble cottages and farmhouses. Bonfires were lit in town squares as peasants danced around flames that echoed the conflagration that had consumed their oppressors, their voices raised in songs of freedom that had been passed down through generations of those who had waited for this moment of liberation. Pope Clement X issued a papal bull condemning the attack, while privately expressing satisfaction that divine justice had finally been served against those who had used religion as a tool for political oppression rather than spiritual guidance. The Vatican's secret archives contained documents suggesting that certain church officials had been aware of the conspiracy and had chosen not to intervene, believing that God's will was being manifested through human agents who understood that sometimes heaven requires earthly assistance in balancing the scales of justice. The French nobility who had escaped the massacre by virtue of absence or early departure found themselves suddenly unwelcome in other royal courts, as if their survival had somehow tainted them with the revolutionary fever that had consumed their peers. Many fled to distant colonies where they attempted to rebuild their fortunes through exploitation of indigenous populations, only to discover that the lessons of the palace fire had spread to every corner of the civilized world. Marie Delacroix became a folk hero, whose name was whispered in servants' quarters throughout Europe, inspiring similar conspiracies that forced aristocratic families to live in constant fear of their own domestic staff. Her survival and escape ensured that the techniques used in the palace destruction would be documented and preserved for future revolutionaries who might find themselves in similar circumstances, requiring similar solutions. The scientific community expressed fascination with the fire's behavior, noting that the temperatures achieved had exceeded those typically seen in normal building fires, suggesting the use of advanced accelerants and combustible materials that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of chemistry and engineering principles. University professors began studying the remains to better understand how such complete destruction had been achieved with apparent scientific precision. The palace's famous art collection, valued at more than the annual budgets of most European nations, was reduced to ashes and melted metal that created abstract sculptures more honest in their representation of royal power than any commissioned portrait had ever been. The irony was not lost on those who observed that the destroyed masterpieces had achieved greater artistic significance in their destruction than they had ever possessed in their pristine condition. The wine cellars that had provided the foundation for the fire continued burning for 3 days after the initial conflagration, their vintage contents creating flames that burned with colors never before seen by human eyes, as different alcoholic concentrations produced different spectral emissions. Local residents reported that the smoke carried intoxicating vapors that caused strange dreams and visions among those who breathed the aromatic clouds drifting across the countryside. The servants who had participated in the conspiracy but survived the flames scattered across Europe carrying skills and knowledge that would prove valuable to future revolutionary movements, their experiences serving as a template for similar actions against other symbols of aristocratic oppression. Secret networks formed connecting these individuals, creating an underground organization dedicated to spreading the techniques that had proven so effective against the palace. The financial markets in London, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt collapsed temporarily when news of the fire reached trading floors, as investors realized that royal bonds and aristocratic investments were no longer guaranteed by divine protection, but subject to the same earthly risks that affected common commercial ventures. The economic shockwaves rippled through every aspect of European commerce for months afterward. Queen Isabella's surviving relatives found themselves inheriting not a kingdom, but a cautionary tale that served as a constant reminder of the temporary nature of earthly power and the permanent consequences of ignoring the welfare of those who labor to support aristocratic luxury. The crown jewels that had been stored in other locations became symbols of mortality rather than majesty, their previous owners having demonstrated that even queens could burn. The peasant uprisings that followed the palace fire were more organized and effective than any previous revolutionary movements, having learned from the conspiracy's example that success required careful planning, insider knowledge, and absolute commitment to the cause of justice. Royal armies found themselves facing enemies who understood their weaknesses and had prepared countermeasures for every defensive strategy. The ghost stories that began circulating within months of the fire described spectral figures wandering the ruins, still dressed in their finest court attire, but bearing the marks of their fiery deaths, their appearances serving as supernatural warnings to anyone who might attempt to rebuild the symbols of oppression that had been so thoroughly destroyed. These tales became so persistent that the site remained abandoned for decades. The medical examinations conducted on the recovered bodies provided gruesome details about the effects of extreme heat on human tissue, contributing to scientific understanding of thermodynamics, while simultaneously serving as a reminder that regardless of social status, all human flesh responds identically to fire, and that death makes equals of kings and commoners alike. The international diplomatic implications of the palace fire extended far beyond France, as other nations struggled to maintain relationships with a monarchy that no longer existed, forcing a complete re-evaluation of European power structures and alliance systems that had been based on the assumption of royal permanence. Treaties had to be renegotiated and trade agreements restructured to account for the new political reality. The insurance companies that had provided coverage for royal properties across Europe suddenly found themselves facing unprecedented claims as nervous monarchs demanded compensation for potential revolutionary attacks, leading to the development of new actuarial tables that attempted to calculate the mathematical probability of peasant uprisings and servant conspiracies. The architectural lessons learned from the palace fire influenced building design throughout Europe, as architects began incorporating fire suppression systems and multiple escape routes into their plans for aristocratic residences, though these defensive measures often proved ineffective against conspirators who had insider knowledge of the building's weaknesses. The correspondence discovered in the palace ruins revealed the extent of royal corruption and cruelty, providing documentary evidence of systematic oppression that had previously existed only in the whispered testimonies of survivors. These documents became the foundation for historical accounts that painted a picture of aristocratic evil so comprehensive that even sympathetic biographers struggled to find redeeming qualities in their subjects. The religious interpretations of the fire varied wildly, depending on the political affiliations of the interpreters, with some viewing it as divine punishment for royal sins, while others saw it as demonic intervention in earthly affairs. Though both perspectives agreed that supernatural forces had been involved in events that exceeded normal human capacity for destruction and revenge. The psychological impact on surviving nobility manifested in various forms of madness and paranoia, as former oppressors found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, unable to trust their own servants, and living in perpetual fear of experiencing the same fate that had befallen their peers. Many retreated into isolated castles where they lived as prisoners of their own terror. The legend of the palace fire grew with each telling, until it became a mythological event that transcended historical fact, inspiring poems, songs, and stories that celebrated the triumph of justice over tyranny while serving as warnings to future generations about the consequences of ignoring the suffering of the oppressed. The tale became a rallying cry for revolutionary movements across multiple continents and centuries. The technical analysis of the fire's progression revealed innovative use of the palace's own infrastructure against its inhabitants, demonstrating how familiar architectural features could be transformed into weapons when understood by those with sufficient motivation and knowledge. The ventilation systems, Electrical wiring and structural supports had all been turned against their intended purposes, with devastating effectiveness. The economic theories that emerged from studying the fire's impact suggested that revolutionary violence could serve as a market correction mechanism, forcing the redistribution of accumulated wealth when peaceful methods had failed to address systemic inequalities. These ideas influenced later economic thought and provided intellectual justification for similar actions against concentrations of unearned power and privilege. The preservation of the ruins as a monument to revolutionary justice ensured that future generations would have a physical reminder of what could happen when the patience of the oppressed finally reached its breaking point. The site became a pilgrimage destination for those seeking inspiration for their own struggles against tyranny and injustice. Years passed, and the grass grew green through cracks in the foundation stones, where children played games that reenacted the night when fire had served as the great equalizer, their innocent laughter echoing where screams had once filled the air with terror. Nature reclaimed the land with enthusiasm that suggested even the earth itself celebrated the return of soil to those who had always truly owned it through their labor and blood. The anniversary of the fire became an unofficial holiday among common people throughout Europe, marked by the lighting of bonfires that served both as celebration of liberation and warning to any who might attempt to recreate the systems of oppression that had been so thoroughly destroyed. These celebrations continued for generations, becoming deeply embedded in popular culture and folk tradition. The final lesson of the palace fire resonated through history as a demonstration that no amount of wealth, power, or privilege could provide protection against the consequences of systematic cruelty and oppression. The emerald necklace that had melted around Queen Isabella's throat became a symbol recognized throughout the civilized world, representing the transformation of beauty into horror when power was divorced from responsibility and justice. A queen crowned in emeralds, 400 nobles lost in fire, one night that turned Versailles into hell on earth. But beneath the ashes wasn't just ruin, it was revolution. The palace didn't fall from war, it fell from within. If power built on cruelty always ends like this, what palaces still stand on borrowed time? Comment with your thoughts on justice and revenge, like if this story burned into your memory, and subscribe to never miss the moments when history catches fire.